Hey, it's Matt. I'm back with another 10 by 7 inch transparent watercolor. This time it's of a Crested Coua. These birds are natives of Madagascar. I got photos of a bunch of these guys at the Toledo Zoo a number of years ago and wanted to do a painting of these. For quite a while, my daughter called these the glam tufted titmouse because they kind of do look like a made-up version of those with all sorts of beautiful colors on the face. After my previous painting, I wanted to do something that was a little bit faster and simpler, and this guy kind of made it to the top of the pile of faster, simpler subjects to do. So in working on this one, after doing the initial sketch, I transferred the painting to some watercolor paper and frisketed it off the background, and then pre-wet the paper with lots of water so we'd have a really smooth background. And so I wanted to kind of have a gradation between the blue sky and some kind of faked in foliage. I'll often, with zoo subjects, you usually have bad backgrounds. And so on this one, I had very little idea of what the native habitat in Madagascar would be, so I just went about faking in a very blurred out background of greens, blues, and kind of give an idea of sky and foliage without a lot of information. And I did this in a couple of passes. I had the initial really smooth pass, and then I went about bringing in some darker ones in front and kind of keeping some of the edges wet, so I had a little bit of information, but not a lot for the background. Kind of just wanted a blurry thing, kind of keeping it really simple and fast on this one. Once I was happy with the background, I peeled off the frisket and went about transferring the rest of the sketch using a folding bone and some tracing paper. So there's my sketch. The tracing paper folding bone trick is awesome for getting a lot of detail quickly onto the page and at just the right level that it disappears when you're done. So at this point I just went about using a biggish brush, I think this is a number 6 round, and just kind of getting in the lightest local colors. And then as I went about glazing in some of the extra layers behind it. I like using a butcher's tray for mixing my colors. That it always reads exactly the way on the way it looks on the tray is the same way it's going to look on the page, which is really handy. So here is just glazing in extra details. And I used a lot of different colors to get kind of the grays, and so for those I'd use some purples and sometimes mix those in with a little bit of browns and greens and things just to kind of give it a little bit more interesting color. For what looks like black on the palette is actually a little bit of green and alizarin crimson that gives you a close to black without being black. And sometimes for the same thing I'll use a little bit of, I'll take some ultramarine blue and I'll mix that with a little bit of burnt sienna, and that gives a nice dark that has some personality to it. It's blackish without being black. For the face, I used some dioxazine purple, and I would bring in some ultramarine blue for some of the other areas in that, as well as a little bit of magenta. And then for the blue-greens, I was using phthalo blues, phthalo greens, bringing those in many different layers. Here I've switched to a number 2 round brush. If you get a sharp number 2 round, you can get a lot of detail with those. And yet they hold a lot of water, so they make it easier to get everything on the page. For some of the tiny details, like there's some little hairs around the eye, I did use a 10-aught brush. And usually I do those details late in the painting, so you're not lifting them up with the other washes that you're putting in. The hardest part of this painting probably was the really light feathering on the crest of the bird, and then next to that probably the area around the eye with all the crazy colors and the gradation between the purple and the blue greens. But to get that crest to read correctly was kind of a challenge, because you wanted to be able to see what was behind it with the sky, because it is kind of transparent because it's so filamentous, and so you're painting it with darks and letting the white of the paper show through in some places to give an idea of the edging of some of those light plumes around the head. The zoos are a great place to get photo reference. I always supplement a lot of that information from the zoo photos with actual, internet research and book research on what the birds actually look like. Because sometimes you'll have color shifts when they've been in captivity, especially with flamingos and things like that, because they're not eating the usual food. Sometimes their colors are a little more subdued. Sometimes the beaks are a little off, or from being trimmed or not trimmed, and they can just look different than the wild ones. So I usually try to at least get information on those things to make sure that the specimen they have there looks like what it should look like. And the other thing is, with the zoos, the backgrounds aren't always ideal. Some zoos do a great job. They have beautiful, painted backgrounds. They have, really nice foliage and live plants in the area. Usually they're not accurate to what the bird is normally around, but at least it gives a nice sense of environment and a happy place to be living in. But I'm sure it's a pain to clean those things. So a lot of zoos kind of skimp on the foliage in the backgrounds. The Toledo Zoo does a really nice job. That's a good place I found that to be good for photographing and getting reference. So for these feathers on the edge of the bird, I usually end up putting those in kind of late and kind of streaking in with a really sharp brush some of the darks to give an idea of where those plumes are lying on top of the other ones. If you try to do it in another way, it's kind of difficult, but by bringing in those darks late with a really sharp brush, it usually works pretty well. I did find when I peeled the frisket of this off the page of this one that it was kind of older frisket, and as it peeled up, it did kind of mess with the surface of the paper a little bit, so it was just lifted the grain of the paper up a little. So my washes kind of on the actual bird went down a little bit funny until it was, after I had a bunch of layers, it seemed to be responding again normally, but it was not super cooperative early on. Sometimes that happens with frisket. The fresh bottles usually work the best. So there you go. That's a 10 by 7 inch painting of a Crested Coua. If you get a chance, have a peek at the blog or leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.